Hello, sophomores. Mr. Ristau here. We're back together again looking at content notes for chapter 26, and this is going to be the material that is going to be covering largely the 1950s, American society and culture during that decade, actually starting in 1945, but most of it's going to be coming in the 50s. So let's get right to it. As always, at the beginning of these slides, here is your preview slide. Here are some of the bullet points that I pulled out of the chapter for you. Be taking a look at these. One of the main themes here, one of the big time works of the decade, was a book called The Affluent Society, which is kind of a theme for the decade. And some of the key terms here, the military industrial complex, that actually is very important, that bullet point there, especially since the College Board redesigned the course back in 2015. You very well could see a multiple choice question, or maybe even something with a DBQ or an SAQ perhaps dealing with that. So we're going to talk about that a little bit with President Eisenhower. Beatniks, GI Bill, some of these things popped up in chapter 25, right down to Levittown, the interstate highway system, and this new region of the country nicknamed the Sun Belt. So here we go. Some of the key things the College Board wants you to know. We are talking about main topic areas that deal with the culture, American culture after 1945, and also the economy after 1945. So if you take a look at here, remember these learning objectives, these are great examples of what could be an LEQ or even a DBQ because they're written this way. Make sure you know the causes of the economic growth that took place after 1945, after World War II. And this was in large part because of the private sector taking off, soldiers coming back home, people having built up demand, they are ready to spend. Federal spending, the baby boom, all kinds of new technology that was spurring on demand and consumer spending that would lead to economic growth. Down here, make sure you're be able to explain the causes and effects of new migration patterns of various groups of people in America after 1945. And this was largely led because of new higher education opportunities and new technologies that expanded in the country. People were becoming more socially mobile because of the highway system and the automobile. Suburbs started to sprout up in this new part of the country known as the Sun Belt, which is essentially the southern and southwestern part of the country. People are moving there. Why? Because it's sunny there. Also because, of course, there were economic opportunities there as well. And this would lead to large political changes if they would become a political force and an economic force as well. And then finally, make sure you can explain how mass culture was maintained over time in this part of the country. Mass culture became increasingly homogenous, which means that it linked the country together. So there are a lot of similarities throughout the country no matter where you went after 1945. And that would lead to good things, it would lead to challenging things, and it would also lead to the youth of the country starting to rebel against authority figures like parents and law enforcement by the time the 60s came around. So, take a look at this photograph here. This is a great photograph that is emblematic of the 1950s, and just ask yourself, how does this photograph reflect some of the major trends that shaped the middle-class family and the middle-class family life in the 1950s? And that's largely what we're looking at here is the middle class and middle class life. Okay, so just kind of take 10 seconds, ask yourself that, what are you looking for here? What is emblematic here of the major trends that help shape middle class values and middle class life during the 50s? Well, if you said, for one thing, this was a traditional family of four that you see here in the photograph. You have a mother, you have a father, you have a daughter, you have a son. The average number of children in a family was 2.4 to be exact. Some families, of course, had 3, but typically you saw a family of 4. And you would see a family of 4 like this spending time together. Here they are outside. There are traditional gender roles, right? You have a mother serving food, which was a primary gender role of women during the 1950s in America. She's serving food to her family, including the father. That's key. That was not the father's job. That was not the father's role. And you also see signs here of affluence, right? Not influence, but affluence. So wealth, well-to-do anyway, right? The middle class, not necessarily upper middle class, but the middle class, and signs of consumerism, right? They have goods, they have products that they've purchased to take on their trip. Looks like a camping trip of some kind. And they even have special camping equipment, right? Which means that they of course could afford to buy the tent and the pots and the pans and everything that goes along with camping, plastic dishware, etc. And it's probably safe to assume that they're probably on vacation. Could even be someplace out west, right? Looking at the mountains in the background here. It's probably funded by paid vacation time, by dad's paid vacation time, probably from his business, from his corporation, or whatever job he might have. All right. The other question I want you to think about is, what does the photograph suggest about the value that Americans, maybe these four right here, placed on domesticity during the 1950s? Okay, so domesticity, this idea of home, this idea of valuing the home life, the family life. So what does the picture suggest about the value that Americans placed on the home? Well, even though this picture, this photo, was taken obviously outdoors, in fact, it was taken at Zion National Park in Utah, the scene itself is very domestic, right? The woman is serving what looks to be a pretty hearty meal to her husband and to her children, who are sitting at a table with all the features and finishing touches of home, right? There's a table, there's a tablecloth, pots, pans, the plastic dishware, the utensils, all the things that we would find in our home, right? There's a fruit bowl, there's silverware. They're posed in front of the family's quote-unquote home, away from home, which of course is the tent in the background. It's essentially an outdoor version of suburban life. Suburban life was very much like what you see here, right? Except this, of course, is outdoors. What I mean by that is it's showing that people valued the roles and accessories of home, of domesticity, enough to take them along whenever they left home, right? So the value of home, the value of domesticity, was very prevalent in people's lives, especially the middle class, during the 1950s. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how this economy went from Great Depression of the 30s, and of course it recovered during World War II, to an economy that basically dominated the world and became the world's most powerful economy by the 1950s. One reason is that there was an international finance institution that was created known as the Bretton Woods system. And the Bretton Woods system was created or designed during World War II by the major powers of the war. And through this system, it created the World Bank. And Bretton Woods was an international conference. The leaders met at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in July of 1944. They created the World Bank to provide loans for the reconstruction of war-torn Europe and European former colonies. And with it, they also created the IMF, for the International Monetary Fund. And this was largely set up to stabilize world currencies and to provide a very predictable monetary environment by which countries of the world could trade. And the US dollar would serve as the benchmark currency. In fact, in 1947, the first General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, also known as GATT, G-A-T-T, established a system for countries to participate in so they could trade peacefully, and this would lead to large economic global growth. The Bretton Woods system is based on the ideas of an open market economy, something that really didn't exist before World War II, and the ability to make U.S. capital, and what I mean by that is basically money, U.S. financial institutions, available to other countries who shared similar beliefs and goals as the United States. Now, the military-industrial complex, this is a term that you're going to want to know very, very well. This is a term that the College Board has emphasized since the redesign in 2015. And the military-industrial complex is a term that refers to how industries during World War II benefited from government contracts for military supplies. By 1961, the defense industry employed almost 4 million Americans, and President Eisenhower, there he is, warned against this complex gaining too much political influence. Companies like Boeing, companies like General Electric, these are companies, huge corporations today, right? Companies that you have heard of, had government contracts that would provide military supplies to the Defense Department. And in return, they, of course, would be paid for producing those goods, for those products. After 1945, the U.S. government operated in a state, essentially, of perpetual readiness for war. And the Pentagon, the Defense Department, became such a huge, massive government bureaucracy. Businesses would enter into these contracts with the Defense Department, and they would share in the profits coming from the government. For example, 60% went to Boeing, General Dynamics. Raytheon was another defense contractor. Defense spending during this time represented about 10% of all U.S. goods and services that were produced during this time period. Federal spending would continue to increase throughout the Cold War and into the space race once the Russians put Sputnik up in space, and once the United States, of course, put man on the moon, government spending continued to increase. It focused largely on increasing U.S. universities' capabilities. Military spending the government would spend money on resources and social programs. And like I said, once the Russians put Sputnik that you see here, this is actually a replica of Sputnik. Sputnik wasn't very big, it wasn't a big satellite, but the event of launching this satellite into space certainly was. This began the space race in 1957. And once this took place, government spending on defense industries and Cold War ammunition and weapons and whatnot certainly increased a lot. By the end, Congress passed the National Defense Education Act, and with that act, the United States started to prioritize sending students to college, having them focus on courses and jobs and careers in the sciences, because this was right around the same time that NASA was built. And then our pursuit of putting man on the moon really started to heat up by the early 1960s. So here you have a famous photograph known as the kitchen debate. And the kitchen debate took place in the late 1950s. Here you see is the Soviet premier, the Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev. He came to the United States in 1959, and he met with Vice President Richard Nixon. And it turned actually into kind of a competitive debate between the two men. They jousted back and forth about whose country was more prosperous and who had the better technology. And here you see them looking at the typical American kitchen. In this case, they were looking at a clothes washer and a dishwasher eventually, because here Vice President Nixon is showing Khrushchev all the new technologies and everything that a capitalist economy could produce, and how we were so much further ahead than the Soviet Union. This is a great example. If you YouTube the kitchen debate, you can see the two men going back and forth and talking about and taking this tour of these new technologies that the United States possesses, with Vice President Nixon bragging about how great the United States is over the Soviet Union, and Khrushchev responding about how further ahead they are in weapons technology. Speaking of weapons technology, here you see an example of the military-industrial complex, right? You see companies like this one, Boeing, for example, building these giant B-52 and B-17 bombers. Companies like Boeing and GE, like I said, and Raytheon would get these contracts from the government, right? They were contracted to produce so many weapons and planes and bombs and things like this. And of course, they'd be paid in kind, and they would share in the profits along with the government. All right, along with this post-war prosperity and affluent society, we'll continue here with how this economy recovered throughout the war and then came to dominate the world. And part of it also had to do with corporation, the rise of the corporation and corporate power. Economic power was consolidated into corporations, and this continued to increase after World War II. Expansion into foreign markets. The United States pursued foreign markets. That would increase after World War II. And there were critics of corporate culture And they noted that the country was creating what they called organization men, and I kind of put that in quotes, or corporate men, who were determining how the rest of the country should live. And from about 1947 to about 1975, worker productivity in the United States more than doubled. And corporations grew in power, and they would come to dominate large share of the markets. And this was the time when we started to see, for the first time, international corporations. Corporations that we know are international today, like McDonald's and Starbucks and you name it, right? But a lot of these corporations at the time were just mainly confined to the United States. But during the 1950s, they started to become more globalized, more international markets. And corporations and work started to become more highly mechanized, and they started to replace factory workers. Now, this is a great example of continuity, a CCOT type of idea, right? Continuity and change over time. Because if you recall, mechanization took place during the late 19th century, the late 1800s. Mechanization started to replace farmers, and it really sped up the agricultural process, right? Growing of crops and things like that, but also the Industrial Revolution. And now we see it start to take place again in the 1950s. So that was one of the things that actually stayed the same. There was some continuity there over a period of 70 to 80 years. We also have the economic record. And during this time, we have the affluent society. This is this term that's used to describe largely the middle class. And the affluent society argued that the poor were not the focus of politicians and economists when they probably should have been. And to give you an idea, annual gross domestic product, GDP, is what the United States is capable of producing in a given year. All the goods and services that are produced here in the United States jumped from about $200 billion worth of stuff in 1945 to more than $500 billion by 1960. And by 1970, the United States had a $1 trillion economy. That's right, trillion with a T. So this new prosperity meant a rise in personal income. This income was being filtered down into the middle class. They were becoming a very prosperous, very large. More and more people are entering the middle class. There was very low inflation. And by 1960, almost 65% of American families owned their own homes, which is a staggering number. Almost 7 out of every 10 families owned their own homes by 1960. The percentage of wealth controlled by the wealthiest Americans started to go down, which meant that more and more people started to enter the middle class. In other words, it was being distributed more fairly, more equitably. However, conditions at the bottom, working class and the poor, became much worse. And one of the key critics, authors that started to point this out was Michael Harrington. And he wrote his famous book known as The Other America, where the focus of the book is actually on the poor in America. And this was a bestseller, and it told the story of how the other half lives, similar to what we talked about during the Gilded Age. But The Other America, written by Michael Harrington, is a title that you will want to pay attention to. And it actually would serve as a book that would influence President Johnson's Great Society in the 1960s. All right, so here you see a nice graph, a nice bar graph that shows you how GDP, gross domestic product, in other words, how much stuff we were able to produce after World War II. And if you see here, after World War II, so about 1945, you can see how it just starts to skyrocket between 1945 and 1960. And then it really starts to take off again from 1960 to about 1970. All right, so we become about $1 trillion economy in about the mid-1960s, late 1960s. All right, so we were a nation of consumers, right? And we always have been. By the 1950s, compared to the 1920s, there were a lot of new consumer products. There were a lot of new media outlets. In other words, television became a huge form of media. In fact, it was during the 1950s that TV finally replaced radio as the primary means of entertainment, primary means of media. And of course, we live in a mass consumption, a mass consumer society in the 1950s. Now, this is one of those ideas, one of these topics that you could see again on the exam, right? Where you're asked to compare maybe 2 different decades, or this is something you could provide in an LAQ to earn that unicorn point. comparing eras. We know the 1920s was a mass consumer decade. There were a lot of new ideas, a lot of technology, new innovations. The 1950s was very similar. Okay, so keep that in mind as you're going through the material. The GI Bill was passed by Congress. This came up in Chapter 25. Remember, the GI Bill made it possible for millions and millions of veterans who came back from World War II, or anyone, frankly, going into the military. It provided education opportunities for them to go to college. This was the decade, the 50s and the 60s, where more people are starting to attend college than any other time in American history. Over 7 million veterans attended college or trade schools during the 1950s, and what this would equate to eventually would be a higher paying workforce. More than 50% of college students post-war were veterans. Okay, universities started to become bigger. Universities started to expand to meet the demand for more and more college students. There was an increase in earning power, which meant that there now was going to be more consumer spending. And this just was a cycle that continued during the 50s and 60s. And this also led to more home ownership. All right. Speaking of homes, the Veterans Administration, the VA, the large federal agency, started to provide home loans for veterans, cheap home loans for veterans returning from the war and their families. Trade unions, labor unions, started to get into the act as well. Collective bargaining, the idea that unions could sit down with employers, with management, and negotiate a contract was embraced by workers through World War II and after World War II. Unions would be demanding higher wages, but they also wanted to be able to afford the products that they were producing. So, for example, the United Auto Workers Union, people who worked on the assembly lines making GM automobiles, they wanted to negotiate contracts that allowed them to purchase the actual cars that they were producing themselves. And that came about in what was known as the Treaty of Detroit, where workers accepted the use of collective bargaining as the primary method of setting employment terms. So in other words, they could sit down, they could negotiate a contract, they could negotiate wages, they could negotiate benefits. Unions worked to provide their members with pensions, pension plans, health insurance, largely for workers who were not organized. People who were not organized, workers who were not part of a union, these were still challenges that were still not resolved, the idea of better wages and health insurance. But largely, not only did union membership increase in the 40s, but so did income. Income rose for many, many workers in the 1950s. And this is what helped fuel this increase in consumer spending. And like I said, more and more workers are now afforded health insurance and pensions upon retirement. All right, so what you see here, you see dozens and dozens and dozens of people here, both men and women, sitting in a college course, probably a lecture class because of the number of people here. We're probably talking well over 100 people. But these are college students who are probably in large part attending this college course on the GI Bill, especially if they're males. If they promised to go into the military, or maybe they went into the military then would help pay for their college by way of the GI Bill. Or if they already served in the military and they wanted to go back to school as a veteran, the military would help pick up the bill for them to attend college. Right? So here you see a nice graph, shows you the degree in the increase of labor union strength during this time. So this is a graph you're looking at. These are non-agricultural workers. In other words, these are union members. In other words, it doesn't count farmers. So you can see that between 1930 and 1945, labor union strength was at an all-time high. And then you can see it started to decline slowly from about 40 to about 1950. And then it was kind of an up and down period. And then union membership and influence started to decline from about 1950, 1960 on. And it continues to decline largely to this day. So you can see the heyday of union membership and union strength was largely during the Great Depression, right, thanks to FDR. to about 1945, 1950 or so. Okay, continuing on with the affluent society. Here we have, again, with the theme of we are a nation of consumers. And things that we have to mention for sure are the number of families that continue to own homes, continue to buy homes, but not just homes, cars, and how children were impacted. Consumption for a typical home drove post-war America, the American economy, including home appliances like refrigerators, dishwashers, and automobiles, both of which consumers were encouraged to replace every few years. So it's a little bit different than today. So if people were encouraged to replace them every few years, right, you've got some massive consumption going on in each home, especially in the middle class. Children were also encouraged to consume, especially baby products, toys for children, children's products. Many families purchased homes and cars during the 1950s. 25 million homes were built and purchased between 1945 and 1970. This is just a ridiculous number of homes that were either built or purchased by families in this short 25-year period. Most homes had TVs throughout the late 40s and 50s. A lot of homes just had one, but by the late 50s and 60s and 70s came around, it was very common for a home to have more than one television. Of course, on these TVs started these things called commercials and advertisements, and in these commercials, of course, they would be promoting consumer products, right? And as far as television goes, in 1947, there were 7,000 TVs in American homes, just 7,000 in 1947. 3 years later, in 1950, there were 7.3 million. So it went from 7,000 to 7.3 million in just 3 years. And by 1960, almost 90%, 9 out of every 10 homes, had at least one television set. TV became the principal link between consumer and the market, right? And like I mentioned above, it was largely because of advertising and commercials. By the early 1960s, these big companies that we have today were creating advertising campaigns. They had visual narratives, right? They would tell a story about their product, and that was attractive to a lot of people. Sales of advertised products rose dramatically. There were TV shows that would portray middle-class life. So, for example, you take a look at here a popular TV show of the 50s known as Leave It to Beaver. TV shows during the time largely portrayed families as white, as middle-class suburban families, like you see here, where mothers were the housewives, right? It was their gender role to provide for the family. Think back to that photograph I started the lecture with the family camping, right? Mom's job was to feed the family, take care of the husband and her children, and her primary job was a housewife. Leave It to Beaver was a classic TV show that reflected this middle-class way of life. Another popular title of the day was a show called Father Knows Best. All right, so here you see a group of teenagers. Teenagers was a term, believe it or not, guys, that was created, that was grown, adopted, came out of, whatever you want to call it, out of the 1950s. And of course, it was referring to those people between the ages of 13 and 19, right where you guys are. All right, so the word teenager does have an origin, and its origins lie in the 1950s. Okay, so here's another image that I want you to look at. Take a look at this image. Take about 30 seconds. I'll have you look at it. Take a look at the subjects in the image. Take a look at its setting. Ask yourself what you think the purpose of it is. You notice this is an advertisement for Motorola televisions. Okay, if you look carefully, it features a television in a wooden case. That's the way TVs came, believe it or not. They weren't the 96-inch, plasma TV that you could put on a wall or anything like that. They came in a wooden case like this. And it also included a record player. Hopefully I'm not too old to ask you guys if you know what a record player is. But if you look here, here's your TV, right? And here's your record player. You play record albums, or a turntable it was called. And if you look at the setting is a very well appointed suburban living room, right? With the family sitting around. In fact, it looks like to me Grandpa and Grandma are even there in the foreground. The family is very well dressed. We've got 2 parents, 2 children, and like I said, even grandparents. So ask yourself, for what audience do you think, if we do a little sourcing, a little hipping here, for what audience do you think the Motorola company created this advertisement? In other words, what is the message? Well, if you said that the ad is first pitched to women, you might be correct. You probably would be correct. And the reason I say women is because that women wielded a great deal of power as consumers in this era of the 1950s. Okay, it wasn't necessarily dad. Quote unquote, mom was the only person standing in the ad. Right? Take a look at the ad. Mom right here, she's the only person standing up. And the ad explains to her first, quote, what Motorola TV means to your family. See, up here? The ad is specifically talking to mom. And then it breaks down what Motorola TV means to mom, what Motorola TV means to dad, to the kids, and to the older folks, it says. The ad is also pitched to men, because men, right, dad, the father, were the breadwinners of the family. So for him, TV means, quote unquote, relaxation after work and a really cheap form of entertainment at home. TV here by Motorola is pitched to the entire family as a family activity, something that every family needs to make their home complete, right? Bring your children, bring the grandparents. It's a whole new world of magic and fun-filled education sitting watching television, even for the elderly grandparents, right? This can bring hours of happiness without leaving the home, is what the advertisement says up here. Okay. So another question that I want you to ask yourself is, how does this ad reflect the influence of the Cold War technology of the day? You probably didn't think I would throw the Cold War in here, but this ad actually reflects Cold War values. So think about that for a couple seconds. How does the ad reflect Cold War technology? Well, if you think to yourself and answered something about the television, you're on the right track. The TV itself was a result of wartime technology, of World War II technology. The bottom of the ad down here, you can't probably read it very well, but the bottom of the ad explains how TV's quote-unquote newest improvements. In other words, it has a glare guard screen. It has simple controls. It has a record changer. It has a radio, right? Straight from the 1920s. Here's the radio. And it also has, quote, a long life dependability chassis. So that's, in other words, the guts, the inside that we can't see that's being protected by the wooden case. All of these improvements were probably created and they were fueled by research and development that was conducted by scientists and engineers that were connected to this military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower would warn the country about when he left office in 1959. All right, so there's a Cold War connection here too. So not only is there a domesticity connection, and Motorola television ads were designed and pitched toward mom, towards dad, towards the kids, towards the grandparents, but there was also a Cold War technology element to this ad as well. Okay, continuing on with this post-war prosperity, we have the youth. I mentioned before the word teenager, that term teenager, was created. It was a creation of the 1950s. Teenagers were also targeted by advertisers and to buy their products, especially once rock and roll music came about by the likes of Elvis Presley, which we'll talk about here in a moment. But movies and media of the day glorified youth, glorified the young, and rebellious men. For example, the James Dean movie Rebel Without a Cause came out. That personified James Dean, the actor James Dean, as a rebellious young man challenging authority throughout the movie. And then you had the advent of rock and roll in the 1950s. A DJ in Cleveland, his name was Alan Freed, played what were nicknamed race records. Well, really, they were records that Motown, African-American musicians were recording. He played these over the radio, and not only were they very controversial, he played them over Cleveland airwaves. Not only were they controversial, but some of the songs that this guy you've probably heard of, Elvis Presley, did were actually covers for a lot of these black artists. And rock and roll was invented, created largely by African Americans, Motown songs coming out of Detroit, but also by Elvis Presley. There's a reason why he's known as the king of rock and roll. The youth culture was defined by its music. Teenagers during the 1950s were defined by the music. And the term teenager emerged as kind of this cultural, it was almost like a phenomenon in the 1950s. And it was identified by advertisers. Okay, teenagers rejected the swing music of the 30s and 40s. They rejected the ballads of the 1940s. And what they did is they embraced the music that was being played by men like Alan Freed and African Americans. They enjoyed the rhythm. They enjoyed the blues. For example, music by Elvis Presley. And many adults viewed rock and roll as a rejection of the teenagers rejecting the social norms of society, right? And they referred to rock and roll as the devil's music. And that's something that really hasn't gone away ever since the 1950s with each new generation. With the 1950s, much like the 1920s, here's another similarity to the 1920s, the 50s also had cultural dissenters. And the dissenters of the 1950s were known as beats, or beatniks, or they were also known as the Beat Generation. And they consisted largely of writers that criticized middle-class values, very much like what you saw in the 1920s, except in the 1920s, we called them the Lost Generation. Specifically, I'm talking about men like F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway. They also criticized middle-class values. Fast forward 30 years, and now we have beatniks. And the most prominent, well-known beat writer of the day was Jack Kerouac and his book On the Road. And his famous book On the Road was a story about his travels and his friends' travels around the United States in the backdrop of this beat generation. So here we have Motown, right? And Motown served as one of the sources of rock and roll music. This was the kind of music that was being played on the airwaves by men like Alan Freed, and a lot of the music early on, especially by Elvis Presley, many of the songs he wrote and performed early on in his career were covers of songs that came out of Motown. All right, religion also started to make kind of a comeback in the middle class during the 1950s, and one of the most prominent evangelical preachers of the day was Billy Graham. Americans started to yearn for kind of a reaffirmation of faith during an age of anxiety. Remember, this was the Cold War. There was a lot of anxiety about nuclear annihilation, the spread of what people called, quote unquote, godless communism. So church membership started to increase from about 49% of the population in 1940 to about 70% by 1960. So Billy Graham, who you see here in the corner, used TV, he used radio, he used advertising to spread the evangelical Protestant Christian message. And then you also had men like Robert Scholler, who was also an evangelist minister from California, telling Americans that so long as they lived moral lives, they also deserved material blessings as well. So men like Billy Graham and Robert Schuller argued that materialism was not incompatible with living a moral life. They said that if you lived a moral life, you were entitled to all the materialistic things in your life. This was also the decade during the 1950s that in the Pledge of Allegiance, the phrase "under God" was added. The phrase "under God" was not part of the original Pledge of Allegiance. And the reason that the government added the phrase "under God" was, of course, in response to the communist threat, or at least the perceived threat of communism during the day. Remember, we talked about the second Red Scare, the House Un-American Activities Committee, right? The belief that communism was being infiltrated into the government and Hollywood. By 1954, Congress added the phrase "under God" into our Pledge of Allegiance. So here you see Billy Graham in front of a large crowd preaching to the people in the early to mid 1950s. Continuing on, we've got the American family and their era of containment. And during this period, from 1945 to 1964, this was a really important time period because it was during this period that the baby boom generation, in other words, all the people who were born between 1945 and 1964 are known as the baby boomers, or the baby boom generation. And it was also by 1964 that the birth control pill was finally created and put on the market. And if you're wondering who this woman is here on the right, this is my mother. She is a baby boomer. Now, this is a photo that was taken many, many years ago. She's certainly not that young looking today, but she was a baby boomer, and she was part of this baby boom generation. And it was during this time, during the 50s and 60s, that we would see a drop in all divorce rates in the United States. Certainly, we don't have the rates that existed then. Certainly, we don't have today. The statistic, I think, today is still about 1 out of every 2 marriages or so ends up in divorce. And what you want to know as far as the College Board goes is what the impact of the baby boom had on America. Well, one of the things is that it led to a very tighter job market in the 1970s, because there were about 70 million people that were born between 1945 and 1964. Okay, my mother, of course, was one of them. And those people, by the time they got to the 1960s, if they were born in the mid-40s, by the time they got to 1960, 1965, they were 16, 17, 18, kind of your guys' age, a little bit older, but they were looking for jobs, right? So there were a lot of people looking for jobs by the 1970s. That's what I mean by a tighter job market. And what does that mean for today? Well, right now we have healthcare and Social Security issues today because so many of these baby boomers are either retired and collecting Social Security, or they are on the verge of retiring and they're going to continue to retire as the years go by. 70 million is a big number. It's a large number of people, and there are concerns that Social Security may not be able to continue by the year 2030 because it's starting to and continues to go bankrupt. All right, so something probably is going to have to change with Social Security and healthcare as the years go by here. It seems like you can't go a day in the news without hearing about healthcare issues and Social Security issues. So what were some of these improvements in health and education that took place? Well, people who got married after World War II, their marriages were quite stable. It included several children. I mentioned earlier the typical marriage had about 2 children. People tended to marry around 21 years old for men, 20 years old for women, and that was fairly typical for my mom, for example, who's still there in the upper right corner. 1950s families averaged about 2 to 3 children, and then the boom peaked around 1957, and it remained fairly high until the 1960s. Okay, there were new medical advancements as well that reduced mortality rates, especially for children. All right, so people are starting to live longer, thanks in large part to this man here, Dr. Jonas Salk. Now, what Jonas Salk is known for, coincidentally, it looks like he's giving this little girl a shot. He's giving him his vaccine. He was the guy who created and developed the polio vaccine. And believe it or not, this guy gave it away for free. Yes, I said that right. He gave it away for free. I can't believe that Pfizer or Moderna would give their COVID vaccine away for free nowadays, but that's what Jonas Salk did. And he changed the world when he successfully developed the vaccine that eventually would get rid of polio. And then you had the child guru, Dr. Benjamin Spock. He wrote his book, Common Sense, the Common Sense book of baby child care. And this book sold 1 million copies every single year after its publication in 1946. And he was the expert. He was the guy to go to and to read his book about child rearing, about child rearing. Okay, so Dr. Benjamin Spock's book, like I said, sold 1 million copies every year, and his expert advice on child rearing was used as kind of the common sense approach, but was not reassuring for mothers who had to work outside of the home. But nonetheless, he still was the child guru of the 1950s. And he argued that mothers should be available for their children, and this is one of the reasons why many women, many mothers who had to work outside of the home didn't find his ideas very reassuring. All right, here's a nice line graph again that shows you how the birth rate between the American birth rate between 1860 and 1980 slowly declined per 1,000 people. But you can see that during from 1945, this is what I was talking about earlier with the baby boomers, 1945 until about not quite to 1960, we saw an increase, this huge increase in the number of babies that were born, the increase in the mortality rate. More people were living longer. That took place, right? It was about the only time there was this increase over this 120-year period. Okay. Looking at women work in the family in the era of containment during this Cold War period, we have expectations. What were the expectations of middle-class women in the 1950s? Well, you heard me talking about them a little bit earlier. In large part, there was this middle-class domestic ideal for women, and their gender roles we see played out, for example, in that photograph that you saw at the beginning of the lecture. Women were expected to raise children. They were expected to attend to the home. They were expected to devote themselves to their husband's happiness. They were expected kind of to play the home psychologist equation of motherhood with quote-unquote normal created tensions in the minds of many women who had to work outside of the home. There was this cult of domesticity surrounding the home. And I asked you earlier in that photograph, what elements of domesticity do you see in that photograph? There was this cult of domesticity that surrounded the middle class and the roles of women. There were economic needs that were put on women outside of the home as a producer. Not every home where mom would go out and work, but there were plenty of women who did have jobs outside of the home. While the domestic ideal claimed her major contribution was as a consumer. All right. So as far as the job market goes, like I said, more women began working to help provide for their families. A lot of these jobs, we saw women as nurses. We saw women take jobs as receptionists. And then also during this time, there was a challenge to middle class morality. And we had men like Alfred Kinsey, who you see here in the upper right-hand corner. He was a man who did a lot of research on the sexual practices of Americans. And what he discovered through his research was that Americans were much more sexually active than most believed and were willing to give themselves credit for and others give credit for. And what this did is it led to the homophile movement. Kinsey revealed that homosexuality was more common than Americans were willing to accept or believed, especially among men. And the reason this is significant is that by 1960s, specifically 1969, this would lead to the gay rights movement and also it encouraged, for example, or it fueled the fire surrounding comic books. There was a belief that comic books encouraged immoral behavior like crime, especially among youth. Playboy magazine was founded in 1953. Playboy was founded by Hugh Hefner in response to challenging societal norms about what was decent. So you had things like this coming about that were challenging middle-class morality and middle-class values, kind of like what we saw with the Beats and the Beatnik movement challenging authority and what was accepted largely among the middle class. All right. Finally, we have a nation that is turning into a suburban nation. And what I mean by that is we have the post-war housing boom. And just to give you an idea, 1 out of every 3 Americans lived in the suburbs by 1960. And this was largely aided by the role of the automobile, but also by the interstate highway system. And it all began largely with a guy named William Levitt and his inception of Levittown, but also by the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA. And Levitt what he did is he applied mass production techniques to home building. And his home building project began on Long Island in New York. And for $7,990, that would buy you a basic 4-bedroom home, or a 4-room home in 1947. That would include, believe it or not, all the kitchen appliances. So in today's dollars, you're looking at about a $76,000 home. Okay, now that $76,000 home wouldn't buy you much today, but that's what $7,900 was worth back in 1947. It bought you the same as what $76,000 would buy you today. Levittowns were then, the idea of them caught on. And like I said, he mass produced these things. They were cheap. They were similar. It's as if they were being cut out of a cookie cutter. And many other real estate development businesses caught on with these. Levittowns were built in New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, with all other builders creating very similarly styled homes. And you had institutions, I shouldn't say institutions, agencies, the federal government agency, the Federal Housing Administration, and the Veterans Administration that I spoke of earlier, offering mortgages or loans. And a person really didn't have to put down a lot of money. So a person who was maybe buying an $8,000 home maybe only had to put down not even 10%. 10% of $8,000 would be what, $800 is all. And maybe they only have to put down 5%. So for only $400, that would get you an $8,000 home. So very cheap homes, right, with very little money down. You had the FHA, and what this did is it helped increase the number of people who could actually own their home. We talked about this earlier. And despite the Supreme Court ruling during that time, discrimination and prejudice still existed in the home industry, the home buying industry. Now, the other thing that I wanted to mention too is that the interstate highway system also helped fuel this post-war housing boom. And the interstate highways were created due to the National Interstate and Defense Highways Act. We talked about this in the last chapter. And this act by Congress helped create 42,000 miles of interstate highway. And this was created under the Eisenhower administration. And I mentioned in class under Chapter 25 material that the interstate highway system was also created out of a sense of national security. It wasn't just to get people from point A to point B, but it was also out of the need for national security because it was a creation of the Cold War. And what this highway system did is it led to a growth of hotel chains, food industries, oil consumption, for example, tripled. And there was a massive increase in the number of cars on the road. This act, the Interstate and Defense Highways Act, provided $26 billion, with a B, billion dollars over a 10-year period for the construction of our national interstate system. So broad highways would ease the evacuation, for example, of people, right, needing to leave cities in the event of a nuclear attack. So that's why they were also built with national security in mind. You also had the creation of fast food, the fast food industry and the shopping mall industry. And we can't talk about the 1950s and suburban America without Ray Kroc. And maybe you guys know who Ray Kroc was. He was, of course, the founder of McDonald's. Developers of shopping malls built these new structures called shopping malls that became destinations for a lot of suburban people. They went there, of course, we know them as malls, right? They were brought there to buy products. Ray Kroc, for example, bought the franchise from a couple of brothers. Little did they know what they were giving up. But Ray Kroc turned McDonald's into the largest chain of restaurants in the world and became a very, very wealthy individual. So here you see the main U.S. highways in 1930. Right, and you can see that they kind of were mainly situated on the East Coast, right? Largely New England, eastern states. Some started to seep into the Midwest. But you can see here that by 1970, this was the outcome, right? This was what happened as a result of the National Defense and Highways Act. Now we have interstates that spread east to west, of course, and north to south. And with those highways, we saw the advent of more and more automobiles. Oil consumption, like I said, tripled. Hotel chains sprouted up all around the country, as did places like this, restaurants and drive-ins and drive-in movie theaters, all forms of entertainment for people who were willing to go out on the road. And then to wrap things up, we have the rise of the Sun Belt. What exactly is the Sun Belt? Well, the Sun Belt refers to the states located in the south and southwest portion of the United States, the area that you see here shaded. And it was during this time in this area of the country where industries boomed, especially military bases. And why did they boom? Well, because it's sunny there. The warm weather people were attracted to. And in these states, they had very low tax rates. And this trend would continue, especially in California, ever since World War II. We would have an increase in the population in these states now for the better part of 65 to 75 years. And we focus on here California because California had a lot of, and still does, a lot of defense industry jobs that I spoke of earlier, the military-industrial complex. And we see in California a huge population explosion. And Orange County, California, for example, where LA is, started to become known as a Sun Belt suburb. And this is best exemplified by Orange County. In other words, there were new facilities there that were built for Marines, for the Navy, for the Air Force. It brought in new developers to build houses and shops for men's families. We even saw the creation of Disneyland, right? Disneyland is located outside of LA. And we know Disneyland is that amusement park that was built during the 1950s, very similar to Coney Island when it was built back in the 1920s out on the East Coast in New Jersey. And then finally, we had the creation, or not the creation, but the United States was largely becoming, or the belief the United States was largely becoming two societies, one that was urban and one was suburban. So one of the demographic changes that was taking place is that many whites were moving to the suburbs. It was known as white flight. While that was going on, many African Americans were simultaneously moving to the cities in large numbers. And it got so serious, I guess, the U.S. government, President Johnson, who you see here on the right, commissioned Otto Kerner, this man in the middle, to head a congressional commission to do some research, to do some studying about this and collect data and then report back to the president. And what this commission found was that they did indeed see trends where the country was moving toward two distinct societies, one that was white, one that was black, and they were separate and they were unequal. All right. So this is largely then divided along racial lines. We had the more white, affluent suburbs by the late 50s and 60s. And then we had kind of the more inner city urban parts of the inner city where a lot of the African American population was moving. Now that wasn't the case in every single city, but these were some of the trends that the Kerner Commission started to see and report to the White House back in the 1960s. All right. So here you see some of the shifting population patterns that started to take place and what the Kerner Commission started to see as well. where you see the bigger red dots here, where the 1950 population and the 1980 population, the larger the circle, the more population, the more people live there. Places like New York, places like Los Angeles. And then you see states here, the darker the shaded states, those states saw the largest percent increase in their population from 1950 to 1980. So like I mentioned, here is your Sun Belt, right? And you see a lot of these states here are darker shaded blue, Arizona, New Mexico, and Florida, to mention a few. All right, so we have this two societies country taking place, and we had basically what was called an urban crisis. Many African Americans that live in the cities are living in old apartment buildings. They're dilapidated. Many are run down. African Americans generally who had jobs, not all, but they are receiving low-paying jobs. And what the urban crisis is referring to is that in the 1950s, the nation's 12 largest cities lost about 3.5 million whites while gaining 4.5 million non-whites. So what I'm saying is that poverty starts to intensify. African Americans in these cities, like I said, had very low-paying jobs. They had very inadequate housing. Builders wanted to keep the middle class from leaving the urban centers of big cities, so they marketed new housing for them and not for black residents. Remember, I said earlier, despite U.S. Supreme Court decisions, there was still a lot of discrimination within the housing industry in many cities. Urban, quote-unquote, renewal started to take place among cities where there was a movement to push to destroy these old buildings and to relocate residents to federal housing projects. Many were built in Chicago, New York, and cities like that. And as far as urban immigrants go, it was in 1943, if you recall, the Chinese Exclusion Act. The Chinese Exclusion Act was finally repealed in 1943. Remember, this was the act that was passed in 1883 that kept the Chinese population largely out of the United States. Well, 60 years later, Congress repeals that. Many Mexicans who were part of the Bracero program in World War II remained in the United States after this program ended in 1964. And we also see an influx of Puerto Ricans to the United States as well. In fact, there were more Puerto Ricans living in New York City than there were in the capital of San Juan, Puerto Rico. And we also saw a huge influx of Cubans come from Cuba once Castro took power in Cuba in 1959. Many of them fled to Florida, specifically Miami. Okay? All right, guys, we made it. It took a little bit longer than I'd like, but we did make it. Here's our review page. Make sure you're looking at these bullet points as you go through Chapter 26 material. And I will post this to the unit folder, the resource folder on Schoology. Hope you enjoyed this lecture, and we will talk to you soon. Bye for now.